Good afternoon. I'm Timur Kuran, and this is an event co-sponsored by the Center for International and Comparative Law and the Duke Islamic Studies Center. The event is also part of a year-long series on human rights and Islam that is organized by Professor Ellen McLarney. Our speaker today is Professor Anne Elizabeth Mayer. Professor Mayer teaches in the Department of Legal Studies and Business Ethics at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. She's written extensively on issues of Islamic law in contemporary legal systems, comparative law, international law, and the problems of integrating international human rights law into domestic legal systems. A major portion of her scholarship concerns human rights issues in contemporary North Africa and the Middle East. One of her books, Islam and Human Rights, Tradition and Politics, is in its 4th edition now, and she is working on the 5th edition. Professor Mayer's topic today is Islam and Human Rights in recent United Nations discussions. She will speak around 45 minutes, leaving a little bit of time for Q&A. Thank you. Anne.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. As many people here can probably testify, I've been clogging the arteries of academic publications for many years, writing about tensions between international human rights law and Islamic law. By the way, when I'm talking about Islamic law here, I only mean Islamic law as presented and portrayed by governments in the Middle East and North Africa, the region that we call the MENA region. What I have observed in the last few years amounts to a striking change in the way the relationship between Islam and human rights is being portrayed by countries in the MENA region, and also by the Organization of the Islamic Conference, the OIC. This organization represents all countries with Muslim majorities, and MENA governments have played a leading role in the Organization of the Islamic Conference. It's very important in this regard because it has coordinated the stances of its members on human rights issues in the United Nations. The OIC has a history of promoting the idea that Islam has its own distinctive set of human rights. Among other things, in 1990, it put forward the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam, a document that sharply conflicts with the Universal Declaration. It places religious limitations on human rights, as can be seen in Article 24, which provides all the rights and freedoms stipulated in this declaration are subject to the Islamic Sharia. That is, the Sharia overrides international human rights law. It's also a declaration that offers only a very truncated series of human rights. Many crucial human rights have been eliminated, such as freedom of religion and equality in rights for men and women. Implicit in the Cairo Declaration was a position that was often taken by MENA countries, that United Nations human rights principles are unacceptable for use in Muslim countries because they conflict with Islamic law. For those committed to the UN human rights system, this is troubling because it involves upholding cultural particularism at the expense of human rights. And this goes against the foundational concept of the modern human rights system, as encapsulated in the title of the 1948 document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that it applies as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations, that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in the Declaration without distinction of any kind. Since we're going to talk about cultural particularism, let me distinguish this from cultural relativism just to make sure we're on the same wavelength. Claims of cultural particularism are typically raised by insiders to a country or a culture who appeal to the local culture to justify deviating from international human rights law. And a classic example occurred when the new Islamic Republic of Iran in 1984 proclaimed at the United Nations that Iran would not hesitate to violate international human rights law, which conflicted with Islamic law and had no validity in Iran, a country that was dedicated to upholding its own cultural and religious values. Iran's perspective was it was entitled to assert Islamic cultural particularism and reject human rights universalism. Parenthetical, we don't have time to go into it, but it's interesting that governments think themselves entitled to represent whole cultures. That is problematic. Hardly coincidentally, the countries that are disposed to invoke cultural particularism are mostly countries that have very poor human rights records, and they use their culture as a shield to deflect criticisms of their human rights performance. Credible international human rights NGOs and also local human rights NGOs in the MENA region reject appeals to cultural relativism as incompatible with human rights, which they don't want to see compromised by these appeals to culture. In contrast, cultural relativism is something that typically comes up when we're talking about people who are discussing cultures in general, supporting the general proposition that individual cultures should be allowed to set their own distinctive priorities. Proponents of cultural relativism insist that one set of standards cannot validly be applied to judge what goes on in all the different cultures around the globe. So cultural relativists philosophically often wind up as close allies of advocates of cultural particularisms in opposing the idea of human rights universalism. Back in the 1990s, the world witnessed countries banding together to mount a strong challenge to universalism under the banner of upholding Asian values. In this context, human rights were treated as Western, and Asian countries said that they were entitled to uphold their distinctive Asian cultural traditions. China led the charge in this venture, but various MENA countries also figured in the coalition. And in the 1993 Vienna Human Rights Conference, we saw their efforts come to fruition because the conference produced a declaration and program of action that offered in paragraph 5 an extremely awkward combination of universalism and cultural particularism. This is a very unusual occurrence in UN human rights documents, which normally are very consistent in upholding universalism. In this Vienna Declaration, in paragraph 5, we do see an endorsement of the universal nature of rights and freedoms, but we also see a statement, the significance of national and regional particularities and various historical, cultural, and religious backgrounds must be borne in mind. This is a concession to proponents of cultural particularism, and it resulted, apparently, from the practical need to conciliate the coalition of countries that during this heyday of Asian values discussion were demanding respect for cultural particularisms. It is a political compromise. It doesn't amount to a coherent theory about how one can have both respect for cultural particularisms and respect for the universalism that is the foundational principle of the human rights system. So we were left with this paragraph 5, opening questions such as, how does a universal human rights system recognize the significance of national and regional particularities? What does bearing in mind these various cultural and religious backgrounds entail for human rights? No answers were forthcoming. Recently, the issues raised by this 1993 document have come back to haunt the UN human rights system. There has been a shift away from the former patterns of aggressive promotion of the idea that cultural particularisms entitle countries to violate human rights, to elaborations of much more nuanced positions, where we see claims that there is respect for human rights universalism, but demands for respect for traditional values. And I'll be indicating the recent twists in this tendency. To understand how the perspectives have changed, we need to review some of the past examples of how MENA countries used to invoke Islamic cultural particularism in opposition to human rights. And then we can see what the very different current positions have morphed into. For me, a very apt illustration is that in the past decades, many MENA countries, when ratifying the Women's Convention, which is also called CEDAW, C-E-D-A-W, explicitly indicated that they would deviate from the convention in order to uphold conflicting Islamic rules. So we have them ratifying a convention that requires eliminating all forms of discrimination against women, but then saying it in their reservations, but we're going to uphold Islamic law at the expense of certain provisions in the convention. Now, other parties to the convention made very strong objections to this, saying either you're with the program or you're not. You can't ratify the convention and then say, well, but we won't comply where we have conflicting principles of Islamic law. Muslims saw a very strong problem with what the governments of MENA countries were doing, because these governments spoke as if they were representing a solid, monolithic Islamic culture that determined women's rights, and a culture that barred giving women equality. They spoke as if it were a settled truth that Islamic law was at odds with women's equality. But in reality, there are no such rock-solid rules. There is no Islamic consensus on women's rights. Behind the government statements, there was an Islamic heritage, the elements of which were being vigorously contested within their own societies. Many Muslims have been outspokenly critical of the CEDAW reservations as reflecting not true Islamic authority, but corresponding to patriarchal attitudes and customs. And human rights activists in Muslim countries and Islamic feminists who interpret the Islamic heritage as accommodating and even encouraging equality for women critiqued the Islamic reservations that were entered to the Women's Convention and pressured the governments involved to withdraw them. Now, MENA governments initially acted as if they felt confident that they could discount the criticisms that were being launched at their CEDAW reservations. However, in the United Nations, the spectacle of Muslim women and human rights activists outspokenly denouncing the reservations embarrassed these MENA country governments. They found it very awkward to be claiming at the UN that Islamic law denied equality to half their population, when representatives of that half of the population were communicating to the UN that they rejected the premises of the reservations and insisted that Islam mandated equal treatment for all and blamed the governments for following patriarchal customs rather than opening their eyes to the fact that Islam could accommodate women's equality. Now, the campaigns to get the CEDAW reservations withdrawn have been very impressive, because these are societies that are not very open and not very democratic. And they have managed to get some countries, such as Jordan, Morocco, and Syria, to withdraw their reservations. Let me give you the example of Morocco. Morocco, which is a relatively open society, has room for non-governmental organizations to agitate on behalf of human rights. And they were successful in embarrassing the government to the point that in 2008, Morocco withdrew its reservations to the Women's Convention. These reservations had been entered back in 1993. King Mohammed VI announced this during a speech in 2008, saying, "Our reservations have become obsolete due to the advanced legislation that has been adopted by our country." This move drew praise from civil society and from the women's movement that had made repeated calls for officials to take steps to implement the convention in Morocco. So we see in Morocco official government policies and statements increasingly adapting to the idea of human rights universalism and moving away from assertions of Islamic particularisms. And these changes in positions correspond to reality on the ground because before withdrawing the reservations, King Mohammed VI, who has exceptional authority because he is deemed to be the leader of Islam in Morocco, promulgated reforms to Moroccan law back in, this is January 2004, that discarded almost all the discriminatory features of Islamic law. And when he did this, the king said, these reforms, eliminating discriminatory features affecting women, are in accordance with the spirit of Islam. So in Morocco, we're seeing an increasing move towards acceptance of universalism and adjusting Islamic law to accommodate women's demands for equality. I'd like to contrast this with what has been going on in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's positions have changed, apparently sensing that it is now awkward to maintain that women's equality clashes with Islamic law. Saudi Arabia has revised the way it presents its human rights policies when talking at the UN. However, in an important contrast with Morocco, the Saudi government has not actually made any dramatic reforms to its domestic laws to eliminate discriminatory features. But certainly it has drastically modified the way it describes its treatment of women when it's speaking at the UN. Let me give you an example. In the year 2000, Saudi Arabia ratified the Women's Convention, and it entered a reservation when ratifying that stated, in case of contradiction between any term of the convention and the norms of Islamic law, the kingdom is not under obligation to observe the contradictory terms of the convention. What does this 2000 statement mean? Islamic law and women's equality are in conflict. They're irreconcilable. The Saudi reservation unequivocally indicated that the kingdom's perspective was that Islamic law was binding on it and that it was therefore under no obligation to observe any conflicting convention principles. Excuse me. It thereby advertised to the world that the Saudi version of Islamic law denied women equality. Now, this embodied the old perspective, and if you look at a lot of my writings, they concern this type of position taken by Muslim countries in the old days, very assertive cultural particularist stances. In a noteworthy shift that perfectly embodies in what direction developments are heading, by 2007, when Saudi Arabia submitted its report to the United Nations on its compliance with the Women's Convention, the Saudi government had revised its position to the point that it asserted that Islamic law granted women absolute equality with men. And I see some people looking incredulous. You don't need to believe me. CEDAW, just Google that. You can see the country reports under S for Saudi Arabia and check out the 2007 report. You will find that reiterated throughout the report. No discrimination against women in Saudi Arabia. And the report affirms that Saudi Arabia is committed to upholding Islamic law. So there is no contradiction at all between Islamic law as upheld in Saudi Arabia and the convention, because both Islamic law and the convention uphold women's equality. So you can adhere to Islamic law and uphold human rights. This is a bizarre twist because it embodies the Saudi officialdom in public, in writing, endorsing the Islamic feminist position. The Islamic feminist position is that Islam is an egalitarian religion, a religion concerned with justice for all people, and that Islam from the outset has always treated women as equal to men. The Saudi report goes so far as to make a direct connection between the Islamic sources and the elimination of discrimination against women. It says, the Holy Quran and the Immaculate Sunnah contain many stipulations prohibiting discrimination on the grounds of race, color, or gender, or other forms of discrimination. They contain unequivocal rulings in favor of non-discrimination between men and women, desiring that women enjoy the same rights and duties on a basis of equality. Back to on-the-ground realities. The situation is not like Morocco. Really no progress is being made in Saudi Arabia to dismantle the extensive regime of discrimination facing Saudi women who live really under a system of gender apartheid. And they are victims of very far-reaching discrimination, and they suffer serious human rights abuses. So what we see is a gap between the Saudi official presentation of the situation of women in Saudi Arabia and what is going on the ground, the actual experience of today's Saudi women. So what about the Saudi reservation that entered back in the year 2000? The Saudi representatives have taken the position that this reservation did not mean that the kingdom would deny women human rights in order to uphold Islamic law. So because it didn't mean that they were going to uphold Islamic law at the expense of human rights, they didn't need to withdraw the reservation. So the reservation is still there. Of course, if the two laws are exactly the same, we'd have to conclude the reservation telling the world that Saudi Arabia would uphold Islamic law when it was contradicted by the convention made no sense whatsoever. But the Saudis have apparently decided that it is so urgent to change their portrayal of Saudi policies, to present them as enlightened policies that support women's equality, that they're less concerned with dealing with the logical fallacies in keeping that reservation on the books. So we have a tactical shift at the United Nations, which does not mean that Saudi Arabia has in fact stopped deploying a retrograde version of Islamic law to justify discrimination. But I deem it very significant that the official Saudi position is now that Islamic law and international human rights law are two friendly and compatible systems, because this means an end to the invocation of Islamic particularism, which Saudi Arabia was very fond of asserting in the past. If one even looks at the report, leaving aside the realities on the ground, one gets a sense that equality in the minds of the Saudi representatives is not exactly what it would be in the minds of most people dealing with questions of sex discrimination. For example, the Saudi response to some questions about its report acknowledges that men and women are treated differently in the rules of inheritance. As you may be aware, in Saudi Arabia, women get 1/2 the share of a male in inheriting in the same capacity. Having said that there is this rule, the Saudis then say, there are no distinctions between men and women in terms of rights and responsibilities. Men get twice as much as women get, but that's not a distinction. And then we get the little clarification. Well, it's because men have support obligations and women don't have support obligations. Therefore, it comes out to be a very fair system. The distinction is meaningless. Of course, this ignores the reality that very often women are the supporters of the men in the family, and or that men are not fulfilling their support obligations. So what is going on in all this? It seems very strange what Saudi Arabia is doing. I think Saudi Arabia has picked up on the fact that a foursquare, forthright, aggressive assertion of cultural particularism to reject human rights obligations is now becoming passé. And also Saudi Arabia wants to be a player in the UN human rights system, and to be a player in the UN human rights system, you have to pretend to accept the rules of the human rights system. As you may be aware, earlier in this decade, Saudi Arabia managed to engineer its election to the UN Human Rights Commission. That has now been changed to the UN Human Rights Council, but it's the same organization. And Saudi Arabia obviously wants to burrow into the UN human rights system, thinking that that's a more advantageous position for it than being on the outside and being lambasted with criticisms. There is a rough correlation between the shift in Saudi positions and the shift in the Iranian position. Iran now is seeking to don the mantle of a country that belongs in the UN human rights system while refusing to upgrade its laws. If you read statements made in recent years by Iran's representatives at the UN, you will find that Iran's human rights policies are now being portrayed as serving the goals of the UN human rights system and as supporting the universality of human rights. Dramatic about-face from the public positions Iran formerly took. If you check the report that the Islamic Republic of Iran submitted in November of 2009 to the Human Rights Council, it claims that Iran has an outstanding record of working to realize human rights. However, interestingly, it makes a little reference to paragraph 5 of the Vienna Declaration of 1993, the one that calls for taking into account regional, historical, national, and cultural and religious particularities. So there's a hint here that Iran is still wedded to the position that these are important and affect a country's position on human rights. In February of this year, Iran sent a large delegation to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, headed by Larijani, who is the Secretary General of Iran's High Council of Human Rights. And Larijani at the UN declared, Iran has a firm commitment to the promotion and protection of human rights. He rejected all criticisms of Iran's human rights performance and said that Iran has been in full compliance with its international commitments to safeguard human rights. And if you've been following the news and you're abreast of all the repression that has been directed against the Iranian populace as it has protested publicly against the rigged election results, you're aware that for Iran to present itself as a foremost defender of human rights is a bit of a stretch. Iran, following Saudi Arabia's example, earlier this year tried to win membership on the UN Human Rights Council. In this quest, it was thwarted, but in April of 2010, Iran was able to engineer backing for its becoming a member of the UN Commission on the Status of Women. This is the commission that is supposed to set standards for the advancement of women's equality. The commission has the mission to evaluate progress on gender equality, identify challenges, set global standards, and formulate concrete policies to promote gender equality and advancement of women worldwide. Now, fewer countries in the world have poorer credentials than Iran has for undertaking this responsibility. The regime not only imposes severely discriminatory laws and policies, but it has censored feminist publications, it has aggressively persecuted women who agitate on behalf of women's human rights, giving them long prison terms for supposedly breaching national security and other alleged crimes. It has forced many women's rights activists to flee to life in exile to avoid terrible fates. And if you have been interested in Iran's women's campaign on behalf of equality, you're aware that they've launched a campaign called the 1 Million Signatures Campaign, which is a way to muster support, public support for women's equality. And the women involved in that campaign have been subject to really aggressive and rather terrifying repression. Furthermore, Iran's great Nobel laureate, Shirin Ebadi, has been threatened in so many ways that she now thinks that her life is endangered if she stays in Iran. And unfortunately, she's been obliged to move to exile overseas. When I last heard about it, she was living in the United Kingdom. So that a country with this record serves on the commission is very, very troubling. But obviously, Iran is eager to engage with the UN human rights system. We can assume that as a member of the Commission on the Status of Women, Iran will now try to square the circle, asserting in the UN that it upholds Islamic law and follows the rules of international human rights law affecting women, while in reality flouting women's international human rights in its domestic policies. And we have to notice something that's troubling just in terms of the United Nations generally, that Iran was able to get on this commission is symptomatic of a broader problem at the United Nations. It shows a disposition in UN entities to allow countries that are known to be particularly hostile to women's human rights to be included in crucial UN bodies, provided that in their rhetoric, as opposed to in their practice, they back away from announcing their contempt for international human rights. Well, what is the most recent development? It is the interesting Traditional Values Resolution that was sponsored in October of 2009, not by one of the MENA countries, but by Russia. And this means that we have, as I will explain, the MENA countries being in a position now to join with a very powerful country, Russia, which is supported in this endeavor by China, in an enterprise that may be designed to dismantle the entire basis for international human rights by corroding the principle of universalism. Now, the majority of countries in the UN Human Rights Council voted for this resolution last year, including the OIC members that all vote in a block. The resolution calls for promoting a better understanding of traditional values in the UN human rights system. And it wants the UN to study traditional values with the ostensible aim being to enhance human rights. Among other things, it requests the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to convene a workshop for an exchange of views on how a better understanding of traditional values of humankind, underpinning human rights norms and standards, can contribute to the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And this resolution specifically includes the language from the 1993 Vienna Declaration, talking about universalism being combined with respect for various cultural and religious backgrounds. The resolution makes a new assertion when it states that the Council is recognizing that all cultures and civilizations, in their traditions, customs, religions, and belief, share a common set of values that belong to humankind in its entirety, and that those values have made an important contribution to the development of human rights norms and standards. So this is arguing that the shared values of cultures and religions can provide a foundation for human rights. They can be a constructive element. Now, this is troubling for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is when you check who is voting in favor. This was not only a resolution put forward by Russia, but it was backed by countries such as Angola, Bahrain, Bangladesh, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, China, Cuba, Djibouti, Egypt, Gabon, Jordan, Kyrgyzstan, Madagascar, Nicaragua, Nigeria, Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Senegal. These are not countries that are leading lights in trying to advance the cause of human rights. And in particular, Russia's own deplorable human rights record entitles us to react skeptically when we are told that Russia is taking an initiative to use culture to enhance human rights. In this connection, I will mention the commentary by Women Living Under Muslim Laws. This is a very important human rights organization that has for years monitored how Islamic law has been used to deny women human rights in Muslim countries. Looking at the resolution, this organization warned of the harmful potential of bringing consideration of traditional values into the UN human rights system. I'll give you just a few excerpts from its comments. The promotion of traditional values does not necessarily mean the defense of patriarchal norms. Women and human rights defenders have long sought to reclaim traditions and cultures from the purveyors of fundamentalist and reactionary ideologies. The resolution, however, assumes that traditional values inevitably make a positive contribution to human rights. There is no recognition in the resolution that traditional values are frequently invoked to justify human rights violations. In presenting the draft resolution, Russia declined to define traditional values or explain what these meant. We are not alone in fearing these traditional values may be invoked to excuse violation of women, sexual minorities, and other vulnerable groups. And I think one of the more important points that they're making here is that it is extremely peculiar if Russia wants to use traditional values to advance human rights, that it won't bother to explain when asked what it means by traditional values. It refused to give any answer. It's just that we're going to be working on traditional values and bringing them in the human rights system. Let me just give you the reaction of one of the many democratic countries who voted against this, and this is the Japanese position. Looking at the resolution, Japan refused to support it. It said, the use of the term traditional values of humankind without any qualification vis-a-vis international human rights law was unacceptable, although Japan did respect the unique history, traditions, customs, and culture of each state. Overemphasizing these elements could run counter to the universal culture of human rights. And other democratic countries made similar observations. Adding to the concerns that one would have about bringing something into the UN system that the sponsor, Russia, refuses to define, there is the close relationship that has been developing between the current Russian leadership and the Russian Orthodox Church. Let me give you a few brief comments from that quarter about human rights. We have the Russian Orthodox Church's Bishops' Council issuing a document in 2008 calling for resistance to the emerging system of liberal values that contains lies, untruth, and insults to religious and national values. This is the Bishops' Council position on human rights, that we're confronting lies, untruth, and insults to religious and national values. Patriarch Kirill of Moscow has attacked the European Court of Human Rights because it's not taking into account the rights of believers. He says, in our view, the court's rulings often make a unilateral use of individual interpretations of human rights at the expense of the collective rights of the traditional religious organizations that are rooted in the history and culture of the peoples of Europe. He calls for a serious debate, given the actions of the European Court of Human Rights, on the issues and practices of the court where secular law interacts with canon law and the ancient moral and spiritual traditions of the people of Europe. It's pretty clear here. We're getting signals that in the view of the Russian Orthodox Church, human rights offend religious and moral values and are at odds with the collective rights of the traditional religious organizations of Europe. So where do we stand? As I see it, we've moved into an era in which we see a new trend in human rights discussions in the United Nations. Governments that in practice want to uphold religious or cultural precepts at odds with international human rights have changed perspectives on how to do this. They've decided that it is no longer advisable to proclaim openly in UN forums that they reject the universalist philosophy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They think it is not diplomatic to announce that they will refuse to comply with human rights in the interests of upholding their cultural particularisms. Instead, they're seeking to convince the world that human rights can benefit from taking into account the values of culture and religion, that the effects of this will be benign for human rights. And it seems that in their most recent incarnation, these cultural and religious values will be recast as traditional values. At least in UN discussions, we can anticipate that this will mean that countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia, that used to be known for their forthright assertions that Islam was in conflict with human rights and that they would uphold Islamic law, are going to be trying to blend in with Russia and its allies in calling for bringing traditional values into the UN human rights system. They're going to be enunciating principles that superficially seem to respect the principle of universalism, but that actually leave room for the continued deployment of Islamic cultural particularism where it is incongruous in the UN human rights system. As countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia recharacterize their positions in ways that indicate that they consider traditional values and human rights as being mutually reinforcing, we will need to bear in mind that their underlying perspectives on the priority to be accorded to Islamic law may persist, but in new packaging that obscures their actual objectives. Thank you. Yes?
So I have a request for you to maybe clarify your remarks a bit, and then a question about strategy, assuming what you've said is right. So the clarification is you have two stories, although you emphasize the Iran and Saudi Arabia story of changing their rhetoric with respect to Sharia's hierarchy over human rights. Now they're claiming that they're consistent. On the other hand, you have the example of Morocco, where the use of human rights argumentation was effective in having a real legal change on behalf of the government and internationally. And so I guess one question I'm having is just to ask you to clarify, are we seeing sort of a division among countries? That is, some countries are going in the route of really just paying lip service to this idea of human rights and now trying to recast it in light of traditional values and other sorts of norms, whereas some other countries are genuinely moving toward reform. And then, so that's the clarification. And what would be the strategy, assuming that the second category of countries, Saudi Arabia, Iran, et cetera, were to predominate? Because your remarks suggest the UN Human Rights Forum is one place. The Human Rights Council is one among many, many venues, some of which are more independent, have more independent experts. They're regional organizations. The ECHR has been European Court of Human Rights has been incredibly tough on Russia. So there are other venues, and so what would be your strategy, perhaps, for civil society groups or democratic governments that see this reinterpretation as a threat to universalism?
Well, on your first comment, I think you've accurately categorized what we see. And at the civil society level, we're seeing this pressure exerted for greater conformity with human rights. And some governments are acceding to it. And so if you hear Morocco now say, well, we've adjusted to the universalism of human rights, we're no longer invoking Islamic cultural particularism, they're giving you a straight story because they've made these tremendous adjustments. It's not a very long period, going from 1993 to 2008, really changing their position. You have other countries that will be saying things that sound like what Morocco is currently saying. Iran and Saudi Arabia saying, Islam is accepting of women's equality, there's no conflict between the two, when the reality on the ground suggests that they have no commitment whatsoever in practice. And so I wanted just to encourage people to be aware that they would have to look behind the rhetoric to the realities underlying this. It reminds me of dear Louis Henkin's famous statement, 2 cheers for hypocrisy. At least Iran and Saudi Arabia have now decided to be hypocritical. And in becoming hypocritical, they've really accepted the authority of human rights by saying, yes, well, we are conforming to it. They're lying, but at least it puts them in a box where now you can say, and we're talking about activism, they're opening the door to being charged with not walking the walk after talking the talk. With regard to your other comment, I have just a very sad sense that the UN Human Rights Council, which should be a very positive force in the human rights domain, is in the process of being degraded to the point that we will discount it. In fact, if you see something coming out of the UN Human Rights Council, you say, well, that's got to be garbage. And fortunately for us, we have the international human rights instruments. We have international networks of human rights NGOs. We have countries that take human rights seriously. We have the European Court of Human Rights. So all is not lost, but it is a desperately discouraging situation to see an organ positioned the way the UN Human Rights Council is being undermined. And I don't think that we can hold out much hope for it acting with integrity after this vote in favor of the Russian resolution, which I think has a very bad smell to it, as the countries that refused to vote for it noted. Yeah.
Yeah, I have, my main question is, because thank you so much for your talk, and you really addressed, a central issue within human rights scholarship, not just within, and the politics is what you really focused on, is the cultural particularism versus the universalism of human rights. But there's also in your talk not a shadow of doubt about the actual universalism of human rights and the UN system. And yet that is what the central critique of human rights discourse within scholarship, and obviously within this politics too, is that no, human rights discourses are not universal. They're very much their own cultural particularism that came out of very specific European context, and they're being applied to across the globe. And people are saying, well, wait a minute, this doesn't have anything to do with us. And if it is truly a universal system, then of course it should encompass these different traditions without a problem. And as you know, there's a long history within Islamic thought that has done really hard intellectual labor to try and accommodate ideas of freedom and equality within Islamic intellectual discourse. And so the second part of my question is really also about, your talk was really about the non-compliance of meaner countries, even as they pretend to participate in the human rights system. And yet, what we see in the United States, for example, is the exact same hypocrisies that you're talking about, where there's a pretendance to comply, and yet there's still these rampant inequalities in gender, especially the women's economic equalities, violence against women, unfair detentions of immigrants, torture, as we know. That these problems are endemic in the West just as much as they are in the MENA region.
Right, well, obviously I wasn't talking about the United States, right. But since you raised that, I think one reason, sadly, why UN institutions are being so degraded and why countries are so comfortable speaking hypocritically is that they have a very strong sense that the United States policies on human rights, which sound as though the United States is espousing international human rights, one has only to think of the State Department country reports monitoring every country around the world and seeing if they're complying with human rights, that there is a great deal of hypocrisy there. And if you set an example of hypocrisy, you shouldn't be surprised when you're a powerful, influential country. The other countries say, well, the rhetoric seems to be what matters as opposed to the substance. On the universalism of human rights, in my work in Middle Eastern countries, I have found that human rights universalism makes sense to the people there. It's very common in my experience when I'm in MENA countries to see the Universal Declaration of Human Rights posted on boards all around. I can't remember, aside from classrooms, seeing the Universal Declaration posted around any place in the United States. And there's a great affinity for these principles precisely because they address the problems that these people are facing. And on them being too Western, I think we have to give a great vote of thanks to Susan Waltz at the University of Michigan for her wonderful work on the early stages of both the Universal Declaration and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Many of the most important provisions in those documents came from small countries like little Central American countries. Others were contributed by Middle Eastern countries. In fact, one of the strongest proponents of women's equality was the representative of Iraq when the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights was being drawn up. For various reasons, the United States barely participated. Yes, I know that Eleanor Roosevelt was very prominent as the chair of the sessions working on the Universal Declaration. She didn't pretend to be a legal mind. It was not an American document. When you come to think of it, it couldn't possibly be an American document since it involved equality regardless of gender, regardless of race, right? So to say that these are uniquely Western, they have a strongly Western cast, isn't borne out in my experience, and I think Susan Waltz's excellent research in the archives has shown that our assumption that it was the Western delegates, people from Europe and North America, who were very prominent in drafting the substantive provisions, was a mistaken one. Yeah.
You talked about countries like Saudi Arabia paying lip service to improving human rights, but I mean, just recent news seems to suggest that there has been some actual legitimate change as well. Like, there's a parliamentarian that was elected in the Shura Council, I think, or selected or whatever.
I think they're all appointed.
Yeah, I'm sorry, selected. But there was like a female that was recently, I don't know, do you see that still just as a continuation of this lip service, or is that a more legitimate change? I mean, to have, at least from the news articles that Al Jazeera put out, it was very, it was almost an earth-shattering moment for Saudi Arabia to have a woman on the Shura Council. But it seems like you're saying the complete opposite, that that's not really anything substantive. I was just wondering whether...
I think that you have to say, when you look at the overall picture of women's rights in Saudi Arabia, it is horrific. It's horrible, right? And you can find little suggestions of improvement. And by the way, I think things will improve. If you're following Saudi news, you know that they're doing something historic right now. They're actually talking about having a minimum age of marriage established legally for girls, because they've had very ugly incidents recently of situations such as an 8-year-old girl being sold in marriage to a man who's 50 years old, et cetera. And public opinion is turning against these old practices. We also have the example of the new King Abdullah University of Sciences and Technology in Jeddah, which is going to have co-ed classes, right? So there are little hints of glacial change. But for Saudi Arabia to say at the United Nations, there is no discrimination whatsoever in Saudi Arabia against women, that's problematic. I don't see how they can sustain that. Yeah.
I guess just related to the Saudi Arabia question and going back to Morocco, I mean, I'm not sure what it means for women to be on the Shura Council if men actually, I mean, in an authoritarian, undemocratic context, I'm not sure what the significance is of actually extracting these bits of rights for women. And going back to Morocco, I mean, my reading of Morocco is the fundamental reason for the shift in Morocco was really the 2003 Casablanca bombings. So the state saw that actually transformations on marriage law and gender law, might serve to undermine the Islamist kinds of politics in Morocco, and that it might behoove them to ally with the women's organizations that had really been working for 20 or 30 years to try to transform these laws. And I'm not saying that the king, that he's younger, he does differ from his father, there have been shifts in Morocco, but I wouldn't agree. I mean, I'm not sure what it means if you still have political prisoners in Morocco and you have other kinds of restrictions on freedom. I'm not sure we could say that Morocco is both talking the talk and walking the walk. And I also wouldn't want to be reductive and say, oh, Morocco's like Saudi Arabia, or, right? We would recognize the differences. But I think that, these instruments are contested and they're political. They're never neutral of other considerations, whether in the United States or in Casablanca.
Right. Well, it may have been misunderstood. When I said they were talking the talk and walking the walk, I was talking about withdrawing reservations to CEDAW and upgrading their laws, right? That's very different from saying we don't discriminate against women and not upgrading your laws. That's what I was referring to. And yes, I think the Casablanca attacks did have the possibility of injecting much more momentum to this, but the momentum was already there. The king exploited the fact that there was this groundswell of support, and there is room for activism in Morocco. I'm not saying Morocco is Norway, but by the standards of the region, it's a relatively open society, and there was this groundswell of support. And I found it very interesting that when there was a big controversy about the proposed changes in the laws, the Islamists, under the leadership of the daughter of Sheikh Yassin, mounted a big opposition demonstration in Casablanca. And I was subsequently with her at a conference, and she realized that that had been a big mistake on her part because the reforms really were very popular, and she was in a very awkward position and had to say, well, I had to stick with my followers, but I never was against the changes. And so there seems to be, even in Islamist circles, an awareness that women really wanted to have these enhanced protections for their rights in the family. And so it's a positive example of activism and successful civil society pressures for improving human rights. And obviously, there's a lot more to be done in Morocco. This is not the end. Is that all? Well, thank you very much.